Before we dive in, I've got a quick question for you. Where are you watching from right now and what time is it? Drop it in the comments. It's always wild seeing how far these stories travel. Now, imagine this. Radahn suddenly steps into the League of Legends universe. What happens next? Let's find out. The sky over Runeterra doesn't crack open with thunder or magic circles. It stops. Clouds hang unnaturally still. Stars dim as if something unseen has wrapped its hands around them. And across the world, sensitive minds feel it at once. Targonian aspects pause mid-meditation. Ionian spirits recoil. Even the void, deep beneath reality, goes silent for a breath too long. Then the red star falls, not like a meteor, but like a command being obeyed. Gravity bends inward as the impact lands far beyond any city. A shock wave rolling across plains and mountains alike, flattening forests and dragging stone toward a single point. At the center of it all stands General Radahn, impossibly massive, crimson hair whipping in a wind that shouldn't exist, his blades resting at his sides as if the world itself has finally arrived late to him. Radahn doesn't roar. He doesn't announce himself. He surveys. The battlefield instinct in him reads Runeterra instantly. The ley lines humming beneath the soil, the distant presence of gods masquerading as myths, the unnatural balance between magic and mortality. His horse strains beneath him, yet endures, held together by gravity and will alone. Around him, the land warps subtly, rocks lifting just slightly from the ground, dust refusing to settle. This is not conquest, this is arrival, and Runeterra knows the difference. Demacian scouts watching from afar feel their courage drain without understanding why. Noxian commanders miles away grin, not in triumph but recognition. This is something they would follow, or die trying to control. Far above, Mount Targon reacts violently. The stars Radahn once held in place are not the same stars Runeterra worships, yet they feel the pressure all the same. An aspect stirs, realizing with unease that this being does not draw power from belief, prayer, or cosmic approval. His strength is earned, scarred into existence through endless war. Meanwhile, in Shurima's deserts, ancient ruins hum faintly, as if remembering a time when god warriors still walked the earth, when ascension came with a cost that history tried to forget. Radahn is not of this world, but he fits into its oldest wounds far too perfectly. And as night finally resumes its motion, the stars above Runeterra seem fewer, not gone, just restrained, held somewhere beyond sight by a general who once challenged the heavens themselves, and has now brought that same defiance to a world that has no idea what kind of war it's about to inherit. The first to truly move toward him are not soldiers nor champions, but magic itself. Arcane currents twist as they approach Radahn, spells collapsing inward, redirected by invisible pressure. A wandering mage attempts to test him from a distance. A simple burst of energy meant to probe, not provoke. And the spell never reaches its target. It curves, slows, then drops harmlessly to the ground, as if exhausted. Radahn tilts his head, mildly curious, already understanding this world's weakness. Magic here flows freely. It relies on motion, on permission. Gravity does not ask. Word spreads fast, even without messengers. Demacia labels the impact zone a forbidden site within hours, fearing a weapon they cannot name. Noxus, meanwhile, dispatches observers under the guise of diplomacy, already imagining a battlefield where victory is decided before the first blade swings. In Piltover, instruments spike and shatter as Hextech devices register mass where none should exist. Scholars argue late into the night, torn between excitement and terror, because the equations don't balance. Something has entered their world carrying its own rules. Radahn begins to move. Each step presses the land downward, not violently, but decisively. as if Runeterra itself is adjusting to accommodate him. Creatures flee without knowing why. Even predators lower their gaze. He is not radiating bloodlust, yet war recognizes war. His armor bears the scars of countless battles, each mark a story this world has never heard. And he wears them like proof, not warning. When he raises his gaze toward the horizon, the pull follows it. Distant debris shifting, leaves drifting sideways, arrows from unseen hunters falling short, bent by a force they were never meant to resist. Somewhere in Ionia, a spirit god recoils, sensing a presence that does not belong to the balance it protects. In the Shadow Isles, the black mist stirs, confused by a decay it cannot corrupt. And deep beneath Runeterra's skin, where the void listens patiently, something ancient hesitates. Radahn is not prey. He is not even a rival. He is a constant. A mass that cannot be ignored, only worked around. As night deepens, Radahn finally stops atop a rise overlooking fractured land, drawn toward him like a tide. He plants his blades into the ground, not as a challenge, but as a marker. This place will remember him. The stars above tremble, their paths subtly altered, as if the sky itself has begun accounting for his presence. In that moment, Runeterra's long, violent history quietly gains a new axis. And every future war, whether it knows it or not, will begin by asking the same question: where is the general now? By dawn, rumors have already outpaced reality. Some call him a fallen aspect, others whisper of a darken that never broke, or an ascended who refused to fade into legend. None of it fits. Radahn does not stalk cities or demand worship. He does not test champions or issue decrees. He waits, not patiently, but purposefully, like a general assessing terrain before a war that has yet to declare itself. The gravity around him settles into a slow, constant drag, subtle enough that most mortals won't notice it at first. They'll feel it in tired limbs, in arrows that fall short, in spells that require just a little more effort than they used to. The first scouts brave enough to approach never get close, not because Radahn strikes them down, but because their bodies refuse to continue. Knees buckle, breaths grow heavy. Courage turns into instinctive retreat. This isn't fear. It's survival responding to physics rewritten. Those who turn back live. Those who push forward collapse, pinned gently but absolutely to the earth, held there until Radahn passes them by without a glance. He has no interest in slaughter. He has always been a creature of battlefields, not executions. Across the sea, Bilgewater's tides behave strangely, ships reporting currents that pull sideways toward land that shouldn't exert such force. In Freljord, ancient ice groans under new pressure, and old stories stir. Tales of being so heavy with purpose that even the world bends to accommodate them. Seers argue whether Radahn is an omen or a correction, a response to centuries of escalating power left unchecked. The truth may be simpler and far worse. He is proof that Runeterra has never truly defined its limits. Radahn finally looks to the sky again, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in memory. He remembers holding back the stars to save a beloved creature, remembers the weight of the cosmos pressing down on him, remembers refusing to yield. The stars above Runeterra are different, but the principle remains. Slowly, almost reverently, gravity tightens its grip. Constellations shift by fractions, unnoticed by most, but enough to send Targonian astrologers into panic. Something is interfering with the heavens. Not by magic, not by prayer, but by force of will. And still, Radahn does not advance. He allows the world to come to him. Because eventually, it will. Champions will arrive seeking glory, answers, or the thrill of testing themselves against the impossible. Empires will debate whether he is a threat to be neutralized or a force to be pointed at their enemies. Gods will watch, uneasy, realizing that this general does not need followers to wage war. He only needs a battlefield. And Runeterra, vast and violent as it is, has already offered itself. As the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows across warped terrain, Radahn stands unmoving at the center of it all, a red-haired monument to endless conflict. The land no longer resists his presence. It has begun to accept it, and somewhere between that first breath of dawn and the quiet pull of the stars above, Runeterra crosses an invisible threshold, from a world that hosts legends to one that must now live beneath them. That acceptance is the most dangerous part. Runeterra has seen conquerors, tyrants, and gods before, but it has never had to adjust to something that does not seek change, only endurance. Radahn remains where he is for days, then weeks, his presence slowly normalizing the impossible. Paths form around his gravity well. Weather patterns shift. Even time feels heavier in his vicinity, moments stretching just enough to unsettle those who linger too long. The world is not being invaded. It is being recalibrated. Eventually, the first champion steps forward, not in defiance, not in allegiance, but curiosity sharpened into resolve. They feel the pull before they see him, the way every step costs more than it should, the way the air presses against the chest. Radahn acknowledges them with the slightest turn of his helm. That is all. No challenge, no threat. The message is clear. If you approach, you do so by choice. And you accept the weight that comes with it. This is not a duel. It is a measure. News of that silent encounter spreads faster than any victory ever could. Because the champion survives, broken, humbled, but alive. And that unsettles Runeterra more than death ever would. Radahn is not here to prove dominance. He is here because battle is inevitable, and he positions himself where the fighting will be fiercest. Like gravity, he is drawn to conflict, and conflict will be drawn to him. Far away, those who watch the stars begin to understand the truth too late. Radahn is not resisting Runeterra's cosmos. He is anchoring himself within it. His gravity reaches upward as much as it presses down, weaving into the celestial order, until separating him from this world would mean tearing the heavens themselves. The stars adjust their courses around him. Fate hesitates. Prophecies blur. By the time Runeterra fully grasps what has arrived, Radahn is no longer a visitor. He is a landmark, a constant reference point in every strategic map and whispered legend. Wars will be planned with his position in mind. Pilgrimages will form, some seeking strength, others seeking answers, most seeking meaning in the presence of something so absolute. And still, Radahn waits. Blades resting, posture unbroken, eyes fixed on a horizon that only a general of endless wars could see. This is how the Starfall general enters the League of Legends universe. Not with conquest, not with destruction, but by becoming impossible to ignore. The moment Radahn becomes a fixed point in Runeterra, the question is no longer what is he, but where does he rank? Power in this world has always been layered. Mortals rise into legends, legends fracture into gods, and gods themselves answer to older, quieter forces that shape reality from behind the curtain. Radahn doesn't sit neatly on any rung of that ladder. He bypasses it. His strength isn't measured by titles, followers, or domains, but by the way everything else must react to his presence. Champions feel it first in subtle failures that can't be trained away. Mobility falters, air control weakens, precision becomes harder to maintain. Against Radahn, raw skill matters less than whether your body and magic can function under crushing inevitability. When analysts within Piltover attempt to quantify him, their models fail immediately. He doesn't spike like a burst mage or scale like a late-game hypercarry. He exerts pressure simply by existing. Fighters who rely on momentum find themselves slowed. Assassins discover that gravity is the one thing they cannot outplay. Even the most disciplined marksmen realize that distance means nothing when trajectories themselves betray them. Radahn doesn't counter champions. He redefines their rules. Comparisons naturally turn toward Runeterra's heaviest hitters. Darken, Ascended, Demigods. Aatrox is the first name whispered, a being forged for endless war, sustained by slaughter and rage. But where Aatrox burns hot and violently, Radahn is cold mass. One consumes everything in reach, the other pulls everything inward. Their clash would not be about speed or fury, but endurance. Aatrox thrives on momentum. Radahn denies it. The longer the battle drags on, the more the field itself sides with the general. Volibear presents a different challenge, a god of storms and savagery, power drawn from primal belief and raw nature. Against Radahn, lightning bends, thunder rolls, but feels heavier, slower, dragged toward the ground before it can fully rage. Volibear's strength comes from wild, uncontrollable force. Radahn answers with absolute control, not suppression, not negation, control. The storm still exists. It just no longer belongs to itself. Then there are the Ascended, beings like Noxus and Runeterra, whose power was shaped by an ancient system meant to elevate mortals into living weapons. They recognize Radahn instantly, not as kin, but as a warning. He represents what happens when strength is earned without limits, without safeguards, without divine oversight. Against them, Radahn doesn't dominate through superior magic or godly authority. He overwhelms through scale. His gravity does not care about blessings or curses. It weighs them all the same. And above them all, the Celestials watch closely. Because for the first time in centuries, something has entered Runeterra that does not seek their acknowledgement. That indifference is what unsettles the aspects most. Runeterra's power has always been reactive. Even its gods rise in response to belief, conflict, or cosmic balance. Radahn stands outside that cycle. He doesn't draw strength from worship, fear, or destiny. His power is already paid for, purchased through wars that never ended and victories that never brought peace. When he moves, he does so with the confidence of something that has already faced extinction and refused to yield. That makes him unpredictable in a way no prophecy can prepare for. Pantheon's presence is felt long before he arrives, not the man, but the idea. Defiance sharpened into a weapon. When Atreus finally approaches, spear in hand, he does not see a tyrant or a god, but a test. Pantheon has always stood as proof that mortals can challenge the divine. Radahn stands as proof that divinity itself can be irrelevant. Their encounter is not explosive. There is no immediate clash. Pantheon advances step by step, pushing against gravity that grows heavier with each breath. Where gods usually feel pressure, he feels resistance. Radahn meets his gaze without recognition, not dismissive, simply unconcerned. The weight presses down, not to break Atreus, but to ask a question. How far can will alone carry you when the universe itself says no? Elsewhere, champions built around control and manipulation begin to realize the problem Radahn presents. Mages like Lysandra and Syndra feel their dominance over the battlefield shrink. Their power still functions, but the space they command grows smaller, tighter, less forgiving. Zoning loses meaning when the entire field is contested by gravity. Crowd control feels laughably small in comparison to a force that pins everything equally. Even time manipulators sense instability. Slowing effects stack poorly against a presence that already drags reality to a crawl. In the shadows, tacticians reassess everything. Swain understands immediately that Radahn is not a weapon that can be aimed. He is terrain, something you plan around, exploit indirectly, or avoid entirely. Jarvan IV sees an impossible dilemma, a threat too large to ignore, too stable to provoke. Even those who dream of using Radahn against their enemies come to the same conclusion. You do not command gravity, you survive it. As more champions test the edges of Radahn's influence, one truth becomes unavoidable. Power in Runeterra has always been defined by escalation. Bigger spells, stronger gods, higher stakes. Radahn breaks that progression. He doesn't escalate, he compresses. He forces everything else downward into the same brutal equation. Endure the weight or be crushed by it. And slowly, reluctantly, Runeterra begins to understand that its power scale has gained something it never accounted for. A ceiling. That ceiling reshapes how conflict is even imagined. For centuries, Runeterra's wars have followed a familiar pattern. Escalation invites intervention, intervention invites catastrophe, and catastrophe resets the board. Radahn refuses to play that cycle. He does not arrive in moments of crisis to tip the scales. He exists before, during, and after them, an ever-present pressure that makes excess power a liability instead of an advantage. Champions who rely on overwhelming force find their strengths dulled, not because Radahn negates them, but because their power collapses inward under its own weight. Consider beings who embody extremes. Aurelian Sol, the forger of stars, would normally exist beyond comparison. Yet even he would feel something unfamiliar here. Not dominance, but resistance. Radahn does not challenge creation. He interferes with its freedom. Stars can still burn, but their paths are no longer sacred. Cosmic motion, once absolute, now encounters friction. For the first time, a being born of the heavens must acknowledge something that refuses to move aside. The void responds differently. It probes Radahn not with hunger, but with caution. The void consumes meaning, unravels structure, turns existence into absence. Radahn, however, is structure. He is mass given purpose. Gravity is not something the void easily dissolves, because it is not belief, flesh, or magic. It is law. Void-born that approach find themselves distorted, compressed into malformed shapes that struggle to maintain cohesion. The void does not retreat, but it pauses, recalculating a threat that cannot be simply erased. Even tricksters and chaos makers feel constrained. Shaco's games lose their edge. Zoe's playful reality warping bends strangely, snapping back harder than expected. Unpredictability itself becomes difficult when the battlefield resists sudden change. Radahn does not enforce order through rules. He enforces it through consequence. Every action has weight now. Every movement must be paid for. In Shurima, ancient Ascended study Radahn from afar with a mixture of awe and dread. They remember what it was like to be weapons, to have purpose carved into them by something greater. Radahn chose his purpose. That difference matters. Against Nasus's patience, Radahn offers permanence. Against Renekton's fury, he offers inevitability. Neither can overpower him, because neither can outlast him on a field that drains everything but resolve. And that is where Radahn truly sits on Runeterra's power scale. Not at the top, not at the bottom, but at the point where power stops being about victory. He is the test every force must face, not to see who wins, but to see who remains functional when stripped of advantage. Gods still exist. Monsters still rise. Legends still clash. But now, all of them do so beneath a weight that does not care who they are. Radahn does not dominate Runeterra's hierarchy. He compresses it into something smaller, harsher, and far more honest. That honesty is brutal, because once advantages disappear, all that's left is intent, and Radahn exposes intent without mercy. Champions who fight for glory find their motivation collapsing under pressure. Those who fight for conquest discover that territory means nothing when the ground itself refuses to cooperate. Only those who fight because they must, to protect, to endure, to exist, retain clarity in his presence. In that way, Radahn doesn't just measure strength, he filters it. This realization spreads quietly through Runeterra's most dangerous minds. LeBlanc understands that Radahn cannot be manipulated, only redirected at great cost. Mordekaiser senses something almost insulting. A warlord who rules no empire, commands no armies, yet exerts more influence over conflict than any conqueror in history. Even he recognizes that forcing Radahn into servitude would require breaking gravity itself, an act so destructive it would leave nothing left to rule. As calculations continue, a final comparison emerges, one that unsettles even the gods. Radahn is not equivalent to a god, a Darkin, or a celestial. He is closer to a natural constant, like entropy or pressure. You do not defeat such things, you adapt to them, delay them, or perish resisting them. That places Radahn in a category Runeterra has never truly faced before, a being whose power is not conditional. In practical terms, this shifts everything. Team-based warfare becomes fragile near him. Coordination fails as spacing collapses. Reinforcements arrive late, slowed by unseen pull. Retreats turn costly, sometimes impossible. Victory no longer belongs to the side with superior force, but to the side that planned for Radahn's presence long before blades were drawn. Even absence becomes meaningful. Where Radahn is not, conflict accelerates. Where he is, it stabilizes into grinding, exhausting stalemates that break morale rather than bodies. And that is when the final truth becomes clear. Radahn is not the strongest being in Runeterra. There will always be someone who can strike harder, burn hotter, or rewrite more reality in a single moment. But none of them can stay like he can. None of them can hold the field indefinitely, bending every other power into orbit around themselves. By the time scholars finish debating his place on the power scale, the scale itself is obsolete. Runeterra has gained something far more dangerous than a new apex predator. It has gained an immovable center, a force that does not climb toward supremacy, but pulls supremacy down to meet it. War never goes unnoticed in Runeterra. It echoes upward into realms where conflict is currency and belief is fuel. The moment Radahn settles into the world's gravitational memory, those who embody war begin to feel displaced, as if a throne has been occupied without permission, not challenged, occupied. The war gods do not rush in blindly. They observe first, because whatever Radahn is, he does not announce himself as prey. Aatrox is the first to truly notice, not through prophecy or worship, but through absence. Battles that should feed him drag on without climax. Slaughter yields no satisfaction. The rhythm he relies on falters, as if something is stretching war thinner, denying him the release of annihilation. When Aatrox turns his gaze toward Radahn, it is not hatred that forms, but resentment. Here stands a general who wages endless war without desperation, without hunger. Aatrox fights to end everything. Radahn fights because war exists. That difference is intolerable. From the storm-swept north, Volibear's fury stirs. The land groans beneath Radahn's presence, and the god of the wild hears it as an insult. He is used to the earth breaking beneath him, not bending for another. Thunder gathers heavier than it should be, dragged downward before it can fully roar. Volibear does not understand restraint. He understands dominance. And yet, as his storms press closer to Radahn's domain, they feel contained. The wild remains wild, but it no longer answers to him alone. High above, Pantheon watches in silence. War to him is not indulgence or instinct. It is defiance sharpened into purpose. He has faced gods, monsters, and inevitability itself, and still risen. Radahn complicates that narrative. This is not a tyrant to overthrow, nor a beast to slay. This is a presence that turns resistance into exhaustion. Pantheon does not feel threatened. He feels challenged in a far more unsettling way. For the first time, defiance may not be enough. Elsewhere, quieter war gods take notice. Spirits of conquest, forgotten deities sustained by conflict rather than worship, feel their influence weaken. Radahn does not steal belief. He drains momentum. Wars slow near him. Victories lose meaning. Even conquest must pause to catch its breath. That is an existential threat to beings who survive on escalation. As the realization spreads, one truth becomes unavoidable. Radahn is not competing with Runeterra's war gods. He is changing the conditions under which war itself exists. That shift does not go unnoticed by Targon. The aspects sense an imbalance they cannot simply correct with celestial decree. Stars themselves seem to hesitate, constellations drifting off course in response to Radahn's presence. Soraka, who listens to the cries of worlds, feels a tension in the cosmic weave she cannot soothe. Radahn is not a champion of any one principle, not a god in the conventional sense, yet he interferes with forces far greater than mortal perception. Even the light of the heavens bends toward him, reluctant, as though acknowledging that a new arbiter has arrived, one who refuses titles, worship, or allegiance. The first direct confrontation are subtle. Champions seeking glory or testing their limits approach, and Radahn responds in his typical manner, calm, deliberate, inevitable. He does not strike unless necessary, but the battlefield itself obeys him. Gravity shifts imperceptibly to favor him, pulling opponents slightly off balance, redirecting projectiles mid-air, forcing even the most agile warriors to recalculate their every movement. To an outsider, it might seem like luck or coincidence. To the war gods watching, it is strategy distilled into pure physics. Radahn does not cheat. He exists, and that is enough to dominate. In Noxus, generals debate him feverishly. Swain, ever the strategist, recognizes a threat unlike any other, one that cannot be flanked, deceived, or predicted through typical military cunning. Radahn's power does not rise with ambition. It remains constant, unwavering. A single decisive strike, a single victory, could not contain him. He's not a tool for war. He is a law around which war must bend. This insight terrifies and fascinates Noxian tacticians in equal measure. No longer is the question simply who is stronger. The question becomes, how does one engage with inevitability itself? Aatrox, still simmering with disdain, tests this principle. He strikes from multiple angles, summoning the frenzy and carnage he thrives upon, expecting the ground to break beneath his fury. Yet Radahn's presence resists. The battlefield itself responds to the war god, subtly countering momentum with weight, redirecting violence into inertia. Aatrox's assaults are powerful, destructive, and precise, but they arrive to a field that has been recalibrated against excess. When the dust settles, Radahn stands unmarked, unyielding, while Aatrox himself feels a weariness he cannot explain, as though the act of fighting has been extended into infinity. Even a god of war learns humility when confronted with constant gravity. Meanwhile, Volibear unleashes storms to challenge him, believing that the raw force of nature must prevail. Lightning arcs toward Radahn, torrents crash down, and yet the general's position remains firm. The environment itself absorbs the chaos, diffusing power that would level mountains under ordinary circumstances. Thunder crashes, and Volibear senses frustration unfamiliar to a deity. Nature bends, but not in obedience. It simply cannot overcome the will embedded in Radahn's very existence. Even the wild is forced into a begrudging truce with something it cannot overpower. From Ionian temples to the deserts of Shurima, from Piltover laboratories to the floating citadels of Targon, whispers spread among gods and mortals alike. Radahn is not just strong. He is disruptive, a new variable that defies expectation. War gods who once measured their influence in victories now realize their reach is insufficient. Conflict itself bends toward him, reshaping outcomes before blades are drawn or spells cast. Engagement becomes less about skill and more about endurance, less about ambition and more about survival. Radahn does not fight for glory. He fights because war is, and in doing so, he becomes the axis around which all battles must revolve. That axis is not merely theoretical. Across Runeterra, the implication manifests with alarming clarity. In the Freljord, tribes preparing for seasonal clashes feel their skirmishes unnaturally delayed, arrows faltering mid-flight, ice cracking under feet that should hold steady. In Bilgewater, mercenary bands report inexplicable currents, pulling them off course, tides bending subtly as if the sea itself hesitates in deference. Even in the heart of the Shadow Isles, the black mist recoils at his proximity, unsure whether it should consume or avoid him. Radahn is not merely powerful. He imposes rules on reality itself, and those rules are absolute. The war gods begin to converge, drawn less by curiosity than by necessity. They do not meet Radahn directly at first. Instead, they watch from the peripheries, studying his movements, calculating the influence he exerts. Pantheon senses a being whose approach to war defies mortal and divine logic alike. He recognizes the paradox immediately, a general who wages no conquest, yet commands the battlefield more completely than any army or god ever could. Pantheon's defiance, normally a constant, feels stretched against something immovable. The question of whether he could triumph over Radahn becomes meaningless when the field itself conspires against traditional tactics. Aatrox and Volibear, too, continue their scrutiny. Aatrox's endless hunger for battle meets a resistance that is not alive, but equally unyielding. It is not that Radahn kills him, nor that he strikes him. It is that every swing, every clash, every strategic maneuver is subtly constrained, absorbed, redirected by a force that cannot be bargained with. Volibear's storms, usually an extension of his divine will, crash against Radahn's domain only to be diminished by subtle yet absolute gravitational opposition. The war gods realize that they are no longer simply contending with a champion, a warrior, or even a mortal of extraordinary skill. They are contending with a natural law embodied, a presence that enforces its own terms on the battlefield. This awareness changes strategy immediately. No longer can they rely on overwhelming force, clever tricks, or sheer speed. Each champion, each god, must account for Radahn's gravitational dominance as if it were another terrain feature, one that responds to their presence rather than yielding to it. Even their perceptions shift. Spells curve slightly in midair. Distances mislead. Energy disperses before it reaches its target. Victory is no longer a measure of power, but of endurance and adaptability under conditions that bend reality itself. Radahn has become the ultimate arbiter, and the war gods are forced into a silent concession. Here is a force they cannot conquer, only navigate. Among mortals, the ramification ripple further. Noxus debates weaponizing him, understanding that conventional tactics are irrelevant. Demacia debates containment, yet realizes that offense and defense alike are insufficient. Piltover scientists attempt to measure him, but instruments fail, readings collapse, and even their most advanced hex-tech creations cannot account for the scale of influence he wields. Everywhere, champions and leaders are forced to recognize a singular fact. Radahn does not answer to hierarchy, power, or authority. He is a constant, a benchmark against which all conflict is measured, and nothing in Runeterra has ever operated outside the expectations of the war gods until now. As whispers turn into reports, and reports into strategy, a subtle tension settles over the world. Skirmishes that would once have escalated to full-scale war stall in uncertainty. Soldiers hesitate, dragons pause mid-flight, and even the most disciplined champions sense that engaging Radahn is not a test of skill, but a test of will. The war gods understand that their dominion over battlefields is no longer absolute. Radahn has entered the League of Legends universe, and with him he has introduced an element that defies conventional power. The battlefield itself becomes a living entity, calibrated to his presence, enforcing a new paradigm where endurance, adaptability, and resilience outweigh ambition, fury, or ambition-fueled conquest. Radahn is not simply a new player in the ongoing conflicts of Runeterra. He is the metric by which all war will now be measured, and the gods are only beginning to grasp what that truly means. By the time the war gods fully comprehend Radahn's nature, the landscape itself has already begun to change in subtle, irrevocable ways. Every battlefield he crosses carries a signature of his presence, slight bends in the trajectory of arrows, dust and debris clinging unnaturally to the ground, the air itself resisting rapid motion. These are not spells, they are not curses. They are the natural consequence of an overwhelming force that obeys only itself. The war gods, who have long measured power through dominance and destruction, now face a metric they cannot manipulate. Even Aatrox, who thrives on endless slaughter, finds his strategies undone not by another warrior's blade, but by the silent, unyielding weight of Radahn's existence. Noxus grows anxious, not from fear of conquest, but from the realization that power structures themselves have shifted. Military hierarchies, political schemes, and even the ambitions of emperors become secondary when one constant overshadows them all. Swain convenes his advisors in urgent councils, debating how to approach a general who does not attack, who does not negotiate, and who cannot be flanked. Every conventional tactic fails before it is even implemented. Radahn is not an enemy to outmaneuver. He is the battlefield incarnate, forcing every participant, mortal or divine, to operate on his terms or be consumed by the slow, inexorable pull of gravity. In the north, Volibear rages, striking mountains and rivers with storms that would normally shape continents. Yet Radahn does not flinch. The storms dissipate, their fury redirected subtly but completely by the invisible field he carries with him. Nature itself is tested against him, and it bends without breaking. Even the raw, elemental chaos of the world cannot overwhelm a force that does not seek destruction, only to exist as it was forged, absolute, unyielding, and eternal. For a god of storm and wilderness, the experience is disorienting. For the world, it is transformative. Across the world, the Shadow Isles and the Void take note in their own ways. The black mist recoils from Radahn not because it fears him, but because he does not belong to its logic. The Void hesitates, uncertain whether he can even be consumed or corrupted. Radahn's presence is a variable they cannot calculate, a fixed point immune to the chaos they sow. In every corner of Runeterra, forces that once operated on predictable rhythms now encounter resistance they cannot predict, and that resistance carries no malice, only inevitability. It is a confrontation unlike any other, a being whose power does not escalate, does not demand, does not yield, yet whose influence changes everything by sheer existence. Even among the champions who seek to oppose him, the realization sinks in gradually. The boldest warriors, those accustomed to dictating the flow of battle, feel the subtle weight on every strike, every spell, every footstep. Coordination falters, precision diminishes, confidence wanes. Radahn does not need to fight to assert dominance. He only needs to stand. His influence acts like a gravitational lens, bending the motions and expectations of all who come near. Engagement becomes not a test of skill, but a test of endurance. Victory is measured not by who strikes first, but by who can survive the persistent, immutable pull of his will. Finally, even the celestial observers, the aspects, Targon's star-forged champions, and those who govern fate from distant heights, begin to acknowledge a truth that unsettles their order. Radahn does not compete for worship, nor for allegiance. He cannot be bargained with, tempted, or tricked. He is a force of war without desire, a presence that enforces order through existence itself. The consequences ripple across the heavens. Constellations shift imperceptibly. Star patterns, long thought immutable, warp subtly to accommodate his presence. Prophecies tremble as cosmic forces adjust, realizing that this warlord is not a player within the divine game, but a law unto which the game must now submit. By the time the war gods dare to act, Radahn has already altered the dynamics of the universe around him. He has not struck a single blow, yet the scales have shifted irreversibly. Plans that relied on escalation, on fury, on precise timing, are obsolete. The battlefield now answers first to him, and all others must adapt or fail. Even those who wield godhood and celestial power confront a humbling paradox. No longer can they dominate by force alone. Here stands a general whose influence is not a function of ambition, nor strength, nor strategy. It is a natural constant, a metric of inevitability. War gods who thrive on chaos, conquest, and absolute power find themselves humbled by the quiet, immovable force of a being who has entered their domain not to conquer, but to define the terms of war itself. Radahn's presence forces a reckoning unlike any the League of Legends universe has faced. Victory, supremacy, and power are no longer measured solely by skill or strength, but by the ability to endure under a force that does not attack, does not yield, and does not falter. He is not a rival. He is the axis around which all conflict now pivots, a being whose gravity reshapes destiny and compels even gods to acknowledge that some powers are absolute, indifferent, and eternal. Runeterra will never fight the same way again, because Radahn has made every battlefield his, not through conquest, but by the sheer inevitability of his existence. Wherever Radahn treads, the battlefield does more than obey gravity. It begins to decay. The Scarlet Rot, once confined to the lands he had waded through in his own universe, now spreads with subtle but relentless precision across Runeterra. It is not a storm that destroys indiscriminately, nor a curse that bends minds toward madness. It is inevitability made physical, a slow, creeping collapse that withers what is unprepared, corrupts what is unguarded, and transforms victory into exhaustion. Champions approach, thinking to test him, to strike, to measure their own power. By the time they notice the signs, the faint discoloration of grass, the subtle weakening of stone, the air growing heavy with invisible tension, it is already too late. Radahn does not rush it, does not force it. The rot moves because he exists, and it carries with it the quiet certainty of finality. Runeterra has seen corruption before. The Shadow Isles have swallowed kingdoms and turned them into nightmares. The void consumes meaning and reshapes reality in horrifying forms. Even the black mist and void spawn operate with intent, reacting to the living as predators to consume. Radahn's rot is different. It is not motivated by hunger, malice, or ambition. It does not bend to will, and it does not distinguish friend from foe. It is decay made natural law, an extension of his presence that quietly refuses to be ignored. Champions who step into its radius feel themselves slowed, not just in motion, but in vitality. Armor rusts slightly with each heartbeat, weapons lose their sharpness imperceptibly, and even the strength of their magical energy falters, as if the battlefield itself were siphoning it away. Those who linger too long find their abilities less effective, their reflexes dulled, and their confidence tested. The first to notice are the tactical minds, the observers and strategists who monitor the shifting battlefield for anomalies. Swain's eyes narrow as he studies reports. Soldiers are fatigued without exertion, creatures behave unpredictably, and even the wind seems to carry a subtle lethargy. He cannot identify the source, he cannot predict the spread. Yet instinctively he knows this is not a natural phenomenon. Noxian scholars attempt analysis, but their instruments fail to account for the pervasive influence that stretches across forests, plains, and mountains alike. It is everywhere and nowhere, like a law of physics rather than a curse. Demacia reacts differently. Its knights, who have longed to find honor in battle and virtue in victory, are unsettled by an adversary whose effect cannot be countered by courage or skill alone. They can strike Radahn, they can maneuver against him, they can coordinate their forces, but the rot is always present, always diminishing the efficacy of their efforts. For the first time, they are forced to consider that victory may not belong to strength, strategy, or discipline, but to endurance. Even magic, the most flexible of tools, begins to falter. Spells dissipate more quickly, elemental forces fail to strike with full intensity, and shields meant to protect are subtly weakened. The rot's spread has consequences that extend beyond the battlefield. In Ionia, forests feel heavier, plants droop slightly as if acknowledging the intrusion. In Shurima, ancient ruins begin to crumble, sand blown across the ground, carrying faint traces of decay that cling to unwary travelers. Piltover devices detect anomalies in energy flow. Hextech mechanisms designed to measure and manipulate magical currents reported instability they cannot explain. Even the Void hesitates when confronted with areas saturated by Radahn's influence. It cannot consume what is already being held in a natural, inevitable state of degradation. Champions encounter it with varying degrees of horror. Singed, fascinated by poisons and chemical transformations, studies Radahn's rot with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He has never seen a substance or phenomenon that defies both comprehension and exploitation simultaneously. He cannot bottle it. He cannot weaponize it. And attempts to interact with it directly result in unpredictable reactions. He is forced to step back, forced to reconsider what contamination means when the contaminant is tied to the very presence of a being who refuses to die, to yield, or to act maliciously. Meanwhile, in the Freljord, Brown notices his people growing fatigued on long patrols, as if the land itself resists motion. Even Ash, attuned to leadership and survival, feels the oppressive subtlety of the rot when planning campaigns or movements. The ground itself slows their progression. The effect is neither immediate nor violent, but cumulative, like water slowly eroding stone until all familiar landmarks are changed. Battle becomes not just a contest of skill, but a struggle against the environment itself, a battlefield that has been altered at its core by a force outside comprehension. High above, the Targonian aspects watch with growing concern. They sense something unnatural, something that bends even cosmic energy into compliance. Stars dim subtly as the rot spreads, constellations flicker, and energy that once flowed freely through the heavens encounters resistance. Soraka listens carefully and feels a pull that she cannot correct. This is not mere decay. It is a systemic shift, one that challenges even celestial understanding. The rot does not kill indiscriminately. It undermines potential, neutralizes advantage, and forces the mighty to confront limitations they cannot escape. Champions, mortals, and gods alike begin to recognize a chilling truth. Radahn does not need to attack for devastation to occur. His presence alone, coupled with the rot he carries, is enough to rewrite the rules of conflict in Runeterra. Even champions accustomed to defying death feel its subtle weight. Champions like Vladimir and Karthus, who manipulate life and death as tools, encounter resistance not in battle, but in essence. Life is harder to bend, death is harder to summon, and even magic tied to vitality loses its immediacy. Radahn's rot does not discriminate. It simply exists, and by existing, it changes everything it touches. Any confrontation is no longer just skill against skill, spell against spell, or blade against blade. It is a test of endurance, of adaptability, and of will under conditions that favor no one except the general whose presence anchors it. Runeterra is beginning to feel the weight of inevitability. Radahn's rot is not merely a hazard, it is a paradigm shift. Victory, power, and influence are no longer measured solely by strength or magic, but by the capacity to withstand the slow, immutable spread of decay that follows him. Every engagement, from the smallest skirmish to the largest siege, is now shaped by an omnipresent force that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bargained with, and cannot be defeated through conventional means. It is the battlefield itself asserting dominance, and Radahn is its epicenter. Champions who survive the first encounters find themselves forced to rethink everything they know about war. The longer the rot spreads, the more champions realize that the traditional defenses are meaningless. Shields hold, swords strike, and spells flare, but all are diminished against the quiet inevitability of decay that Radahn carries. Even the most resilient forces, like Malphite's stone body or Galio's magical fortitude, show subtle signs of strain. Armor corrodes, stone weakens, energy flickers. The battlefield itself becomes the opponent, and Radahn does not even need to participate directly. His gravity anchors the world, his rot undermines it, and every movement must now account for forces that cannot be seen or predicted in traditional terms. Demacia, proud of its disciplined ranks and unshakable resolve, begins to notice how their carefully structured formations are less effective. Cavalry loses momentum, infantry tires more quickly, and even the magical wards placed along their defensive lines seem to absorb less energy than expected. Commanders whisper anxiously among themselves, realizing that the very laws of the battlefield are no longer consistent. Tactics that once guaranteed control now falter under conditions they cannot alter. Every engagement becomes a question of endurance rather than triumph, and every victory comes at a cost heavier than anyone could anticipate. In Noxus, the approach is different, but no less desperate. Generals attempt to weaponize the rod, imagining it as a tool to weaken enemy forces before they arrive. Yet every experiment ends in frustration. Hextech devices fail, spells misfire, and even champions sent to measure Radahn's influence report back with observations they cannot fully explain. The Scarlet Rot cannot be captured, studied, or contained. It is not a weapon. It is a consequence of Radahn's existence, subtle yet absolute, and entirely beyond manipulation. The Void and the Shadow Isles watch from their realms, each intrigued but unsettled. Normally, corruption and decay are tools they can employ at will. Here, they encounter resistance. The rot moves not by sentience, but by inevitability, neutralizing even their influence. Void spawn attempt to infiltrate the affected regions, but the patterns of decay warp their forms, disrupting cohesion and slowing them down. The black mist, which normally devours life and willpower alike, cannot fully consume what is already bound by Radahn's presence. It is not opposition, it is inefficiency forced upon the natural predators of the world. Even those who thrive on chaos and unprediction find themselves constrained. Zoe's playful tricks bend awkwardly near Radahn's domain, their timing subtly distorted. Shaco's illusions falter in movement and perception, disrupted by forces he cannot counter. What they once relied on, surprise, speed, unpredictability, is neutralized, not by intervention, but by the passive, persistent presence of the rot. Champions come to understand that their usual advantages are irrelevant here. They are no longer facing an enemy in the traditional sense. They are facing a battlefield rewritten. The psychological impact is equally significant. Fear spreads, not through threat of violence, but through inevitability. Soldiers, mercenaries, and even gods begin to notice the subtle fatigue in their limbs, the way spells require just a fraction more energy, the way every calculated movement feels slightly slower than expected. That delay is enough to undermine confidence. Tactics that rely on timing falter. Coordinated assaults lose their precision. Even the bravest warriors sense that survival alone is already a challenge, and that challenge grows with every second spent within Radahn's influence. In the north, the frail Jord's icy landscapes show the rot's effects in more obvious ways. Snow that should be solid compresses unnaturally, Fissures form beneath traveling patrols, and even glaciers exhibit slight weakening under the subtle pull of decay. Life moves slower, hunters' footsteps falter, and the endurance of warriors is tested far more than their skill. Every journey, every battle, and every exertion becomes a trial, not of technique, but of persistence under conditions that no one fully understands. Across Runeterra, scholars, mages, and strategists are forced to revise everything they know about combat, terrain, and even magic itself. Hextech instruments, Targonian readings, void probes, and Shadow Isle observations all arrive at the same conclusion. Radahn's rot is not a hazard. It is a paradigm. It is the world adjusting itself to a force that cannot be opposed. And the more one attempts to fight or contain it, the more one realizes that resistance is secondary to adaptation. Every engagement, every movement, every campaign must now account for the slow, relentless, and pervasive influence of the Scarlet Rot. Champions who survive extended exposure come away irrevocably changed. Their perception of space, time, and power adjust to accommodate the oppressive weight of inevitability. Spells that once felt precise now require constant recalibration. Weapons that once felt lethal now feel slightly off. Even mobility, the cornerstone of many strategies, becomes a resource to conserve rather than exploit. To fight Radahn is not simply to confront him, it is to endure the battlefield itself, reshaped around a singular, immovable axis. By the time the first major engagements occur, it is clear that Radahn's presence is the ultimate equalizer. Strength, speed, and skill remain relevant, but they are secondary to endurance, adaptation, and patience. Champions learn that under the rot, mistakes are magnified, hesitation is punished, and no advantage lasts indefinitely. The Scarlet Rot is not aggressive. It does not seek to kill. It seeks only to recalibrate, to ensure that every being, regardless of power, is subject to the same slow, inexorable weight. The battlefield no longer favors one side over another. It favors survival, persistence, and those who can bend themselves to endure conditions that defy expectation. Runeterra, in every corner, begins to understand a chilling new truth. Power alone is no longer sufficient. Ambition, skill, and strength are dwarfed by forces that operate outside intention, by decay that does not discriminate, and by a presence that turns every battlefield into a trial of endurance. Radahn has not merely entered their world. He has rewritten the rules, and the Scarlet Rot ensures that no champion, no army, and no god can ignore the immutable weight of inevitability that now defines every war. As the Scarlet Rot spreads further through Runeterra, its effects become increasingly impossible to ignore. Regions once vibrant with life begin to exhibit subtle but alarming changes. Forests bend and droop, not from fire or decay, but from the sheer presence of inevitability that Radahn exerts. Grass loses its spring, rivers slow in their course, and even the wind carries a weight it never bore before. It is not overtly destructive, yet the cumulative effect is undeniable. Animals avoid these regions instinctively, sensing the oppression in the very fabric of reality. Hunters report prey moving slower, predators hesitate in mid-strike, and even elemental forces that once seemed unstoppable now show signs of subtle fatigue. Champions responding to the rot for the first time quickly realize that their conventional powers are no longer reliable. Yasuo's wind manipulation struggles against subtle, persistent forces that alter trajectory. Lee Sin finds his strikes misjudged by fractions of an inch, enough to reduce their impact. Even magic wielders like Lux and Syndra feel their energy dissipating faster than normal, their bursts of power less effective in an environment that refuses to fully cooperate. Every spell, every strike, every movement must now account not only for the enemy, but for the battlefield itself, which moves in ways that cannot be predicted. In Noxus, this revelation sparks a mix of fear and opportunity. Some generals see Radahn as a weapon to be studied, others as a threat beyond reckoning. Swain, always the strategist, begins to map the spread of the rot, attempting to quantify its effect. Yet every model collapses under its subtlety. The rot cannot be cornered, trapped, or contained. It is not bound by logic or morality. It moves because Radahn exists, and every extension of its reach shifts the dynamics of power in ways that cannot be countered by armies, magic, or even cunning schemes. Demacia's knights, trained to excel under structure and discipline, face a different challenge. Their formations, once near perfect in execution, falter under the persistent, slow-draining influence of the rot. Cavalry finds momentum harder to maintain, foot soldiers tire unexpectedly, and magical wards lose efficiency. Even the most disciplined and experienced warriors are forced to acknowledge that victory cannot be measured solely through strategy or valor. They are facing a battlefield that is actively reshaping their potential, testing not their skill alone, but their ability to endure over time. The war gods themselves take notice. Aatrox, whose very existence thrives on endless, brutal conflict, experiences frustration unlike any before. His assaults, designed to overwhelm and consume, meet a force that does not resist actively, but absorbs and redirects the momentum in subtle, invisible ways. The battlefield itself becomes an extension of Radahn's influence, and even a god of war discovers that their power can be mitigated without a single strike landing. Volibear similarly finds that his storms, which normally reshape landscapes and bend nature to his will, are tempered and redirected by the field Radahn carries. Wild fury becomes contained chaos, demonstrating that even elemental forces must now contend with a presence they cannot dominate. Beyond the battlefield, the rot's effects ripple into every aspect of Runeterra. In Piltover, Hextech devices meant to measure energy begin to fluctuate unpredictably, registers collapse, and even the most advanced inventions cannot function reliably. In Ionia, forests feel heavier, the air thick with subtle resistance, slowing even the swiftest travelers. Shurima's deserts, normally shifting but predictable, begin to form slight but persistent distortions, sand clinging in unusual patterns, as if even the wind bends differently here. In these subtle changes, the world itself seems to acknowledge the arrival of a force that operates outside conventional understanding. Champions attempting to oppose Radahn find themselves constantly readjusting, not to the tactics of an opponent, but to the battlefield itself. Singed, fascinated by poisons and transformation, experiments with the rot, but finds it defies analysis, containment, or exploitation. Zoe discovers that playful manipulation of reality bends unpredictably when near him, frustrating even her formidable powers. Even assassins and tricksters who rely on unpredictability, such as Shaco, find their usual advantage neutralized. The battlefield does not favor skill, cunning, or even magic. It favors those who can endure, adapt, and persist. As the Scarlet Rot continues its spread, a new form of tension grips Runeterra. It is not fear in the traditional sense, nor is it immediate danger. It is the slow, creeping realization that the rules have changed. Every conflict, from the smallest duel to the largest war, now carries the weight of inevitability. Victories achieved without understanding the rot's influence feel hollow, and even planning for conventional campaigns becomes fraught with uncertainty. Champions and generals alike confront a reality in which endurance, patience, and adaptability are now the ultimate measures of capability, overshadowing brute strength, speed, and raw magical power. Even celestial observers sense the implications. The Targonian aspects in star-forged deities notice subtle disruptions in the energy that binds Runeterra to the heavens. Constellations falter slightly, celestial currents bend, and the cosmic balance they maintain begins to wobble in response to Radahn's presence. Soraka, whose entire existence is tied to healing and guidance, feels strain in ways that cannot be countered. This is not merely mortal decay or natural disaster. It is a systemic transformation, an omnipresent shift that reshapes both the living and the divine, forcing every being, champion, god, and mortal, to confront the true scope of Radahn's influence. The Scarlet Rot, though subtle at first, becomes the defining factor in every encounter it touches. It does not kill indiscriminately, nor does it show mercy. Instead, it imposes limits, tests endurance, and subtly alters the course of every battle. Engagements are no longer measured by who strikes hardest, fastest, or with greatest precision, but by who can endure the slow, omnipresent weight of decay that follows Radahn. The battlefield itself has become his instrument, and even the greatest champions, gods, and warriors realize that conventional tactics are meaningless when the very land, air, and life force of Runeterra are subtly realigned to serve his presence. Radahn has not merely entered the League of Legends universe. He has rewritten the conditions of conflict, forcing every being, mortal and divine alike, to contend with a force that is inexorable, omnipresent, and absolute. The Scarlet Rot spreads quietly, patiently, inevitably, and the world learns that no skill, no magic, and no ambition can fully oppose the slow, transformative power of a general whose very existence imposes its own immutable laws. Every battlefield is now a test of endurance, and every champion is being measured against the relentless weight of inevitability that Radahn brings with him. As the Scarlet Rot continues to expand its reach, its subtle influence begins to reshape entire strategies across Runeterra. Armies that once relied on precision strikes or coordinated maneuvers find themselves slowed, their timing slightly off, their attacks weakened before contact is even made. The Rot does not actively fight, but it shifts the battlefield in a way that no champion, general, or god can fully anticipate. Siege engines falter, arrows drift imperceptibly from their intended paths, and even magical constructs require more energy to maintain than usual. Every step, every swing, every spell becomes a negotiation with inevitability itself. Champions begin to internalize this pressure. Those accustomed to speed and reflex, like Zed or Katarina, feel their movements slightly delayed, their precision compromised by forces they cannot see or counter. Bruisers and tanks, who rely on endurance and strength, notice subtle fatigue even when exertion seems minimal. Spellcasters find their energy drained faster, their focus challenged by the quiet, persistent pull that Radahn's presence enforces. Even those with control over life, death, and the elements find their powers bending unpredictably, as though the very essence of Runeterra has begun to resist being manipulated. The battlefield has become a living extension of Radahn, responding to his presence rather than any conscious command. This realization spreads to the war gods and celestial beings as well. Aatrox, accustomed to endless bloodshed and chaos, finds his ability to shape conflict frustrated by an opponent who does not fight, but merely exists. Volibear's storms crash with diminished intensity, redirected subtly by the gravitational and rot-infused field Radahn carries with him. Pantheon, the embodiment of defiance, senses a new kind of challenge, one that cannot be met with skill or courage alone. Even the aspects of Targon feel the strain in cosmic energy, the constellations flickering as if resisting the pull of an unrelenting force. Radahn does not seek to conquer them. He cannot be bargained with, challenged, or tricked. He is a constant, and the Scarlet Rot spreads simply because he is there. In the mortal kingdoms, the consequences are equally stark. In Demacia, knights find that formations that once held perfectly now buckle under subtle, cumulative strain. Cavalry loses momentum, infantry tires faster, and magical wards fail to maintain their usual efficacy. In Noxus, generals attempt to weaponize or contain the Rot, but every effort fails. Hextech devices misread its presence, spells falter, and even champions sent to observe are unable to withstand its pervasive effect for long periods. It is not a curse, a spell, or a force to be manipulated. It is a law of inevitability, imposed silently by a being whose presence warps reality around him. The Scarlet Rot also begins to affect the natural world. Forests in Ionia bend and sag under the weight of subtle decay. Rivers slow, their currents hesitant, carrying with them an imperceptible sense of resistance. Mountains, glaciers, and deserts all exhibit signs of gradual weakening, as if the land itself has acknowledged Radahn's dominion. Wildlife avoids these areas instinctively, sensing the pervasive alteration of the environment. Even elemental forces, usually untethered and chaotic, hesitate when operating in regions affected by the rot. Nature itself becomes another battlefield, reshaped not by magic or war, but by the quiet inevitability Radahn imposes. Champions attempting to engage Radahn face the dual challenge of surviving him directly and enduring the pervasive influence that spreads outward from his presence. Singed's experiments with chemical transformation and toxic manipulation fail against the rot's subtle restructuring. Zoe finds her playful bending of reality destabilized, illusions warping unpredictably. Assassins relying on speed, stealth, and misdirection find their tactics compromised by the environment itself. The battlefield is no longer neutral territory. It moves, reacts, and drains strength in ways that favor Radahn by default. Engagement becomes a test of endurance, patience, and adaptability rather than brute force or clever trickery. The psychological toll is profound. Soldiers, mercenaries, and even champions feel the quiet pressure of inevitability pressing down on every action. Delays, fatigue, and minor failures accumulate, slowly eroding morale. Even victories feel diminished, achieved only through tremendous effort against a battlefield that subtly resists. This pervasive strain forces leaders to reconsider every plan, every tactic, and every engagement. What was once a matter of skill and coordination becomes a trial of survival against forces beyond comprehension. The Targonian aspects observe with unease, sensing subtle shifts in celestial energy as the Scarlet Rot extends its influence. Stars appear dimmer, cosmic currents falter, and divine oversight struggles to account for the pervasive, passive decay spreading across Runeterra. Soraka feels the strain on her healing powers, unable to fully counter the subtle erosion of vitality imposed by the rot. The phenomenon is systemic, affecting both mortal and divine alike, reshaping engagements, alliances, and even the expectations of what constitutes victory. Radahn's presence, coupled with the spread of the Scarlet Rot, transforms every battlefield into a trial of endurance and resilience. No champion, god, or general can rely solely on strength, speed, or magic. Success depends on the ability to adapt, to conserve energy, and to persist under conditions that actively resist domination. Victory is no longer defined by who strikes first or strikes hardest. It is defined by who can endure the slow, inevitable recalibration imposed by the general whose very existence reshapes the laws of war. Runeterra is entering a new era of conflict. Traditional measures of power, strategy, and domination are no longer sufficient. Every engagement must now contend with the pervasive, immutable influence of Radahn and the Scarlet Rot. The battlefield itself has become a living, reactive entity, subtly aligned to enforce endurance, adaptability, and survival above all else. Champions learn quickly that conventional tactics are irrelevant. Power is no longer the ultimate measure of success. Persistence in the face of inevitability is. Radahn has not merely arrived in the League of Legends universe. He has imposed a new paradigm, one where the Scarlet Rot spreads quietly but relentlessly, and where the very nature of war has been rewritten to favor those who can endure. Before we dive in, Imagine standing on a battlefield where every force you've ever relied on, strength, strategy, magic, even the will of gods, suddenly feels insufficient. Radahn has arrived in Runeterra, and after spreading his presence and the Scarlet Rot, the world itself begins to adjust. The champions, generals, and deities who have defined the course of wars now find themselves facing something entirely new, a constant, immovable, inevitable force that refuses to be conquered, bargained with, or predicted. This is no mere invader. This is a paradigm shift, a presence that forces the League of Legends universe to confront a level of permanence and authority it has never experienced. In history, Runeterra's greatest battles were always defined by escalation. Powers clashed, armies expanded, and gods occasionally intervened, each victory reshaping the world. Yet even in those grand conflicts, there was always a limit, a tipping point, a moment when strategy, skill, or sheer strength could turn the tide. Radahn introduces something entirely different. He does not seek to tip the scale in his favor. He does not need to. His very existence compresses power, reshapes outcomes, and forces endurance to become the ultimate metric. Where previously wars were decided by aggression, cunning, or divine favor, now they are measured by persistence, by adaptability, and by the capacity to survive in conditions that actively resist domination. This new constant has profound consequences for every corner of Runeterra. In the north, the Freljord's warriors adapt to long campaigns differently, realizing that exhaustion now comes not just from exertion, but from the subtle resistance embedded in every step, every swing, and every spell. Demacia recalibrates its battle doctrines, understanding that precise coordination is no longer sufficient when the battlefield itself acts against predictable movement. Noxus reevaluates its strategies, acknowledging that raw ambition and tactical genius cannot fully account for a force that operates outside intention, a presence that makes even preparation feel incomplete. Even the most cunning Hextech engineers in Piltover find their devices misreading the subtle shifts in energy and motion that Radahn imposes upon the world. The gods themselves are not immune. Aatrox, Volibear, and Pantheon, each accustomed to asserting dominance over mortals and lesser divinities, encounter a limitation that is neither weakness nor defeat. It is structural, embedded in the very field of conflict. Their powers remain vast, but the conditions have shifted. Engagements no longer favor those who strike fastest or hardest. Even a god must account for endurance, patience, and the ability to operate under subtle, omnipresent pressure. Radahn's presence does not diminish their abilities, but it reframes their significance, forcing them to reconsider what it means to exert influence in a world now shaped by inevitability. Across the world, the Scarlet Rot continues to serve as the tangible marker of Radahn's influence. Its subtle decay, its quiet resistance to conventional force, ensures that every engagement carries a persistent test of stamina and resolve. Champions such as Singed, Zoe, and Karthus find their powers challenged, not because they are opposed directly, but because the environment itself, every blade of grass, every stone, every breath of air, has been recalibrated to resist advantage. Even the void and the black mist, forces that operate outside conventional morality and physics, encounter friction. The rot does not fight them, yet their influence diminishes as it passes through, demonstrating that this is not a temporary phenomenon. It is a new, immutable constant. The philosophical ramifications are enormous. Throughout Runeterra's history, power has been measured by dominance, conquest, and the ability to shape outcomes. Radahn reframes this entirely. He does not demand worship, allegiance, or fear. He does not conquer. He does not yield. Yet his presence ensures that every conflict, no matter its scale or participants, is governed by a new metric, endurance under inevitability. Victory is no longer simply skill against skill, nor strength against strength. It is measured by the ability to persist, to adapt, and to survive in conditions that challenge the very concept of advantage. Even in isolated regions untouched by grand wars or political machinations, the effect is perceptible. Forests, plains, and deserts all bear subtle signs of recalibration. Animals move differently, weather patterns shift slightly, and even elemental forces hesitate. In this way, Radahn's influence is universal. It does not discriminate. It is not bound by allegiance, territory, or morality. Every champion, every god, and every creature is forced to contend with the reality that the rules have changed. The battlefield itself is no longer neutral ground. It has become a force of nature, aligned with the immutable presence of Radahn. As champions continue to adapt, a slow, quiet revolution begins to take shape. Traditional tactics, once relied upon to secure victory, are now insufficient without consideration of the constant that Radahn imposes. Speed, precision, and raw power are no longer guarantees of success. Preparation and planning must account for the invisible hand of inevitability, for the persistent pressure that subtly erodes every advantage. Even victories achieved against conventional enemies now feel incomplete unless the influence of Radahn's presence has been considered and survived. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Mortals, champions, and even gods feel the subtle oppression of an unyielding standard. Confidence is tested not by combat alone, but by the pervasive sense that the battlefield itself is conspiring against unpreparedness. Every decision, every movement, every spell carries an added weight of consequence, as though the very laws of existence now operate under the assumption of endurance rather than dominance. Champions who once believed in the primacy of skill and strategy begin to rethink what it truly means to prevail in war. This new constant reshapes history itself. Where once stories of valor, conquest, and triumph defined the legacy of Runeterra, future chronicles must now include endurance as a central metric. Radahn does not simply intervene in conflicts. He ensures that the framework within which wars are waged is fundamentally altered. Battles are no longer simply contests of might. They are tests of resilience, adaptation, and persistence under a pressure that cannot be countered, diminished, or ignored. Even legends and myths begin to shift in tone. The tales of champions who overcame impossible odds now take on a new dimension. Overcoming an opponent is no longer the pinnacle. Enduring the battlefield itself, surviving the persistent pull of inevitability, and adapting to forces that cannot be opposed become the ultimate mark of greatness. Radahn's influence becomes a silent standard against which all acts of heroism, conquest, and defiance are measured. The gods, mortal champions, and even cosmic forces begin to converge on a single realization. Radahn is no longer simply an intruder. He is a constant, an immutable axis around which the dynamics of Runeterra now pivot. His presence ensures that no power, no strategy, and no ambition can operate without consideration of the weight he imposes. Victory is no longer absolute. Power is no longer absolute. The world has adjusted to acknowledge that endurance under Radahn's influence is now the ultimate measure of success. And this realization reshapes not only battles, but the very understanding of history, legacy, and the flow of time itself. Radahn has not merely entered Runeterra. He has altered the rules, reshaped the measure of power, and established a new standard that cannot be ignored. Champions who once defined the limits of combat, and gods who once defined the boundaries of influence, now face a world governed by persistence, inevitability, and the quiet, inescapable force of a general who has become a new constant in Runeterra's history. As the weight of Radahn's presence settles across Runeterra, the consequences extend far beyond individual battles. Entire nations previously confident in their dominance or military superiority are forced to confront a reality where conventional measures of power are insufficient. In Demacia, scholars and generals painstakingly revised training protocols, understanding that precise formations and timing alone will no longer guarantee victory. Every soldier must now prepare for the invisible resistance that seeps into the battlefield, conditioning themselves not just for enemy attacks, but for the subtle erosion of stamina, precision, and confidence imposed by Radahn's existence. In Noxus, a different form of adaptation takes place. The Empire, built on ambition, conquest, and the ruthless application of strategy, faces an unprecedented challenge. Swain and his advisors begin to conceptualize the idea that victory may no longer depend solely on overwhelming force or tactical genius. Instead, survival under persistent, unavoidable influence becomes the most critical factor. They experiment with new formations, staggered assaults, and contingency strategies, but the Rot and Radhahn's gravitational pull defy conventional logic. It becomes clear that no amount of preparation can fully neutralize the constant presence that governs the flow of conflict. Even the Freljord, a land hardened by centuries of brutal survival, finds its warriors subtly tested in new ways. Tribes accustomed to enduring harsh winters, massive beasts, and constant skirmishes realize that the battlefield has taken on a different rhythm. Snow falls heavier, ice shifts unpredictably, and every exertion feels slightly more taxing. The strongest fighters, long celebrated for their endurance, discover that traditional markers of resilience are now secondary to the quiet, omnipresent influence of a force that does not fight but simply exist. Each skirmish, each patrol, and each hunt becomes an exercise in managing fatigue, conserving energy, and adapting to subtle environmental pressures that bend the rules of survival in unexpected ways. The psychological impact of Radahn's influence on champions is equally profound. Those who rely on confidence, aggression, and decisiveness must learn to temper their instincts. Katarina, Zed, and other champions who thrive on speed and calculated strikes find their attacks misaligned not because of counterplay, but because the battlefield subtly resists their natural flow. Even magical champions whose powers often transcend physical limitations sense an ineffable drag on their abilities. Mana burns faster and spells waver mid-course, and energy disperses in ways that defy understanding. The very act of fighting becomes a contest not against an opponent, but against a shifting, pervasive framework that tests the endurance and adaptability of all who enter its sphere. In the celestial realms, Targon's aspects and other divine observers are forced to reconsider the role of inevitability in conflict. Stars that once shone as beacons of guidance begin to flicker subtly as if acknowledging the impossibility of resisting Radhahn's influence. Soraka, whose powers sustain life and offer clarity, finds that even her most precise interventions are limited by the subtle exhaustion imposed on those affected by the rot. Cosmic patterns and prophecies that once seemed absolute falter under the weight of a presence that redefines the parameters of power, endurance, and influence. Even entities tied to chaos and corruption, such as the Void or the Black Mist, recognize that Radahn introduces an unprecedented variable. The spread of the rot and the gravitational dominance he exerts create inefficiencies in their usual operations. Void spawn falter, the mist hesitates, and corruption loses some of its natural cohesion. Radahn does not confront these forces directly, yet his presence alone interferes with their ability to act with precision. The world itself is adjusting, and these chaotic, traditionally unstoppable forces find themselves constrained in subtle, disorienting ways. This growing awareness among champions, gods, and entire civilizations sparks a shift in strategy and philosophy. Power can no longer be measured solely by force, magic, or cunning. Instead, endurance, patience, and the ability to adapt to the immutable pressures of the battlefield have become the ultimate measures of capability. Wars are no longer contests of aggression, speed, or skill alone. They are prolonged tests of resilience under conditions that cannot be controlled, mitigated, or predicted. Champions who previously relied on instinct, talent, or dominance must now confront the uncomfortable reality that survival itself has become the benchmark for success. Leaders across Runeterra begin to disseminate this understanding, subtly altering the way campaigns are planned and executed. Troops are trained not only in combat, but in pacing, energy management, and mental resilience. Champions are forced to reconsider their approach to engagement, focusing on endurance and adaptation rather than purely on offensive output. The very culture of war is transforming in response to a presence that requires recognition of limits previously unimagined. Radahn, through simple existence and the subtle spread of the Scarlet Rot, has rewritten the rules, establishing a new baseline for what it means to prevail in conflict. Across regions, races, and realms, the world begins to internalize a profound truth. Radahn is not simply an invader, a foe, or a force of destruction. He is a new constant, a presence that imposes invisible, inescapable rules on every battle, every champion, and every god. The Scarlet Rot, coupled with the gravitational inevitability of his being, ensures that every engagement is measured not by raw power, speed, or cunning, but by the capacity to endure, adapt, and survive under circumstances that subtly, relentlessly resist domination. Runeterra itself has begun to adjust, acknowledging that the greatest challenge is no longer the enemy before you, but the environment and paradigm reshaped by Radahn's immutable presence. This fundamental shift does not erase conflict, it redefines it. Champions who survive his influence find themselves learning lessons no battlefield or opponent could have previously taught. They understand that preparation, strategy, and skill remain important, but they are insufficient without endurance. Even gods recognize that their influence, while vast, is subject to recalibration in the presence of a being whose existence imposes a persistent, systemic challenge. Radahn has not merely entered Runeterra. He has become a defining constant, one that shapes the very principles of war, survival, and power in a universe that previously relied on strength and cunning as ultimate measures. The world, from the icy peaks of the Freljord to the deserts of Shurima, from Piltover's Hextech labs to the forests of Ionia, has begun to recalibrate itself to this reality. Rivers slow, winds falter, and even the flow of magic is subtly diverted. The Scarlet Rot spreads patiently, omnipresent yet imperceptible, establishing a new baseline for endurance and adaptation. Champions, armies, and gods alike realize that the battlefield is no longer neutral ground. It is a crucible designed to test resilience, and Radahn is at its center, absolute and unyielding, the new axis upon which the history of Runeterra will now turn. As the influence of Radahn cements itself across Runeterra, the subtle but undeniable shifts in every battlefield create a ripple effect that no kingdom, champion, or god can ignore. Soldiers report exhaustion that comes not from overt exertion, but from the invisible resistance embedded in the air, the soil, and even the flow of magic. Cavalry loses the precision that once defined their charges. Archers notice arrows deviating from intended trajectories despite flawless aim. Mages feel energy drain faster than expected, their spells dissipating slightly before reaching full effect. Even champions who normally defy conventional limitations like Echo, who bends time, or Lucian, whose reflexes are honed to perfection, find themselves needing to recalibrate instincts and timing to compensate for a battlefield that subtly resists their advantage. Radahn's presence does not fight them, but it imposes itself on the very parameters of combat, forcing adaptation on every level. Nations begin to document this new reality, revising their histories and strategies to account for a force that defies precedent. In Demacia, the rigid doctrines of honor and precision are tempered with lessons in endurance and pacing. Armies are drilled not just in coordination, but in conserving energy and managing subtle fatigue that accumulates faster than previously possible. Officers observe that formation that once held perfectly now show inconsistencies, forcing a deeper understanding of timing, rhythm, and resilience in addition to discipline. In Noxus, generals attempt to innovate around the Rot, experimenting with staggered attacks, decentralized command, and prolonged campaigns to test the limits of both their troops and the battlefield itself. Even the most brilliant tacticians recognize that the immutable presence of Radahn transforms strategy from aggression into a contest of persistence. The Freljord experiences a similar shift. Tribes accustomed to enduring harsh winters and massive beasts discover that traditional markers of endurance are insufficient. Glaciers shift subtly beneath heavy footfalls, snow compacts unevenly, and the air feels denser, heavier, carrying with it the invisible pull of Radahn's influence. Even champions like Ashe and Sewanni, whose leadership and combat experience are unmatched in the region, notice that conventional tactics must be adjusted. Their campaigns require more careful pacing, rotations of forces, and attention to stamina and environmental factors that would previously have been negligible. Every expedition becomes a test of adaptability as much as skill, and even seasoned warriors find themselves recalibrating instincts to match the slow, persistent pull of inevitability. Beyond mortal and mortal-adjacent beings, celestial and cosmic entities feel the subtle impact of this new paradigm. The aspects of Targon and other Starforged champions perceive shifts in celestial energy, constellation flickering in response to the gravitational and pervasive influence of Radahn. Soraka experiences limitations in her ability to sustain life and heal, sensing the strain on both mortals and the land itself. Even cosmic patterns, once predictable and immutable, demonstrate slight perturbations as if acknowledging the arrival of a force whose existence reshapes the very structure of influence, power, and fate. Prophecies falter under the subtle pressure of inevitability, and cosmic entities must adjust their expectation in ways they have never before considered. Meanwhile, forces of chaos and corruption, void spawn, the black mist, and other entities that thrive on entropy, face friction they cannot overcome. The Scarlet Rot does not actively oppose them, but it impedes efficiency, warping the behavior of creatures that would normally act with absolute freedom and precision. Even the Void hesitates as it encounters areas saturated by Radahn's presence. Corruption cannot fully penetrate regions already governed by inevitability. It is a passive but absolute limitation, forcing chaotic entities to reconsider how they act, how they move, and even how they expand influence. The battlefield has become a medium through which Radahn's presence asserts a quiet dominion, neutralizing both skill and malice without lifting a hand. Champions attempting direct engagement with Radahn quickly realize that traditional approaches are insufficient. Assassins like Zed and Talon, whose precision relies on speed, stealth, and timing, find their attacks subtly misaligned. Spellcasters experience inefficiency in mana usage and fluctuations in effect. Bruisers and tanks feel faint but consistent fatigue, their power diminished by the persistent drain imposed by the Rot and the gravitational field surrounding Radahn. Even characters who manipulate time, death, or energy cannot fully overcome the subtle but pervasive influence that he exerts on every action. The battlefield is no longer a neutral canvas, it is an active participant, reshaped and dominated by the constant presence of an unstoppable general. Psychologically, the impact on Runeterra's inhabitants is profound. Confidence erodes in subtle increments, decisions are delayed by imperceptible hesitations, and the weight of cumulative fatigue becomes a test in itself. Victory is no longer determined purely by skill, strength, or magical ability. It is determined by the ability to endure, adapt, and maintain composure under circumstances that challenge both physical and mental limits. Champions who once thrived on instantaneous reflexes, rapid maneuvers, and clever manipulation must now balance aggression with patience, ingenuity with endurance, and power with sustainability. The societal and cultural ramifications are equally transformative. Armies, academies, and magical institutions revise curricula to emphasize resilience and adaptation. Historical chronicles are rewritten to account for endurance as a primary measure of achievement, and future campaigns are planned with the invisible influence of Radahn as a central consideration. Tactics, once based on dominance or speed, now incorporate rotation schedules, energy conservation, and environmental awareness, acknowledging that every battlefield touched by Radahn carries a persistent weight that cannot be eliminated. Across all regions, from Piltover to Shurima, from the icy peaks of the Freljord to the jungles of Ionia, the realization spreads that Radahn has introduced a permanent shift in the understanding of power. Strength, speed, and magical aptitude remain vital, but they are now secondary to the ability to endure conditions that subtly resist domination. Radahn has not merely altered a battle or defeated an opponent. He has created a framework in which endurance under inevitability becomes the ultimate metric, redefining the way champions, mortals, and gods perceive power, victory, and history itself. In this new era, legends and stories of heroism begin to take on additional layers. Triumph is no longer just about defeating a rival or conquering a battlefield. It is about surviving, adapting, and thriving under pressures that defy conventional understanding. Endurance becomes as celebrated as courage, patience as revered as cunning, and adaptability as essential as raw strength. Radahn, through simple existence and the pervasive spread of the Scarlet Rot, has imposed a new standard on Runeterra, a constant that will influence every engagement, every war, and every tale for generations to come. The world has shifted irrevocably. The battlefield itself is no longer neutral. It is a test of persistence, shaped by a force that does not attack, does not yield, and cannot be conquered in conventional terms. Every champion, god, and soldier now recognizes the quiet, unyielding presence of Radahn as a benchmark, a standard, and a new constant in the history of Runeterra, ensuring that every measure of power, every victory, and every legacy must now contend with the immutable weight of endurance under inevitability. As the realization of Radahn's immutable influence spreads, Runeterra begins to fundamentally rethink its conception of power and legacy. No longer can wars be won through brute force alone, nor can magic or cunning guarantee dominance. The Scarlet Rot and Radahn's gravitational presence impose an invisible metric, a quiet but relentless standard by which every action, every battle, and every champion is measured. From the icy wastes of the Freljord to the shifting sands of Shurima, from the mystical forests of Ionia to the towering spires of Piltover, every being begins to adapt, consciously or unconsciously, to a reality where endurance and persistence outweigh raw might. Champions who once thrived on the immediacy of combat must now recalibrate every instinct. Assassins like Zed and Katarina learn that striking too quickly or relying solely on reflex can leave them drained before the fight is truly over. Mages and spellcasters, accustomed to shaping reality with focused energy, find their magic tempered by the pervasive rot, forcing careful consideration of timing and resource management. Bruisers and tanks, whose strength was once absolute, feel subtle fatigue with each movement, each block, each step, requiring them to think beyond raw resilience and consider the long game of survival. Even gods, long removed from mortal constraints, feel the quiet recalibration of influence as Radahn's presence subtly warps the flow of power in ways that are impossible to resist entirely. Entire cultures and militaries adjust to this new reality. In Demacia, drills are lengthened, rotations of forces are introduced, and campaigns emphasize pacing and endurance as much as precision and coordination. Noxus experiments with staggered assaults and decentralized commands, understanding that conventional strategies alone cannot overcome a force that enforces persistence as a law. The Freljord rethinks its legendary endurance, conditioning warriors to anticipate subtle, accumulating fatigue, and training them to recognize the invisible limits imposed on even the most seasoned fighters. Across every region, leaders, scholars, and strategists come to recognize a profound truth. Radahn has not simply invaded their world. He has imposed a new standard, a persistent constant against which all action must be measured. Even the natural world bends subtly under the weight of his presence. Forests sag, rivers slow, and wind patterns shift imperceptibly. Animals avoid areas tainted by the Scarlet Rot instinctively. Elemental forces hesitate, reluctant to expend energy where influence is constrained. The environment itself becomes a silent agent, aligning with Radahn's immutable authority. Runeterra has become a battlefield in which every engagement is both a test of skill and a test of endurance, where victory is not merely defined by overcoming an opponent, but by adapting to conditions that resist domination on a systemic, almost cosmic level. Legends, history, and culture shift to accommodate this new paradigm. Tales of heroism no longer celebrate mere triumphs of strength or cunning. Endurance, adaptation, and resilience under persistent pressure are elevated to their own forms of glory. Champions who survive the prolonged influence of Radahn are celebrated not only for victories achieved, but for their ability to persist where others faltered. Future generations will study these encounters not as examples of conventional battles won or lost, but as lessons in the mastery of survival under conditions that challenge the very laws of expectation and power. Even the gods themselves acknowledge a new hierarchy of significance. Power, while still vast, is now measured against the ability to operate within a system that imposes invisible resistance. The aspects of Targon, the cosmic forces that once dictated order, perceive the subtle shifts in energy, and even they must adjust their expectations when interacting with a world reshaped by a being whose presence enforces inevitability. The Scarlet Rot, while not sentient, has created a framework for conflict that governs every action, ensuring that endurance and adaptation now define the ultimate measure of greatness. Radahn's arrival is not temporary, nor is his influence fleeting. He has established a new constant in Runeterra, one that touches every battlefield, every campaign, and every legend. The Scarlet Rot spreads quietly but relentlessly, and even as champions, generals, and gods attempt to resist or manipulate their environment, they are reminded that some forces cannot be opposed, they can only be endured. In this way, Radahn becomes both the ultimate adversary and the ultimate teacher, demonstrating that persistence under inevitability is a skill in itself, one that will shape the course of history long after the battles themselves have ended. As the dust settles and the stories of this unprecedented arrival are recorded, one thing becomes clear. Runeterra has been forever changed. No matter the hero, no matter the god, no matter the army, the presence of Radahn ensures that endurance, adaptation, and resilience will be the ultimate arbiters of survival and legacy. The world has been recalibrated to a new standard, and history itself will now recognize that true power is measured not just by victory, but by the ability to persist in the face of inevitable, unyielding forces. So what do you think? Could any champion truly match Radahn under these conditions? Or has the League of Legends universe encountered a force beyond even its greatest heroes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about who might survive, who might fall, and how the story of Runeterra changes now that the Starfall General has become its new constant. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into a crossover of epic proportions, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a dive into worlds colliding in ways you never imagined.